The rain didn't just fall, it attacked the city, throwing itself against the windows of the emergency room with a fury that matched the chaos inside. For Chloe, standing at the end of a 14-hour shift, the sound was a dull, percussive headache. Her light blue scrubs felt like a second skin, clammy and smelling vaguely of antiseptic and despair. All she wanted was the sweet oblivion of her lumpy mattress, a quiet so deep it could swallow the memory of the last patient who had bled out on her watch. Then the doors hissed open, not with the usual panicked scramble of a family, but with the controlled, menacing silence of an invading army. A wall of men in dark, impeccably tailored suits entered, their presence sucking the air from the room. In their center, a man carried an elderly woman, her small frame limp in his arms, a dark stain blossoming on the pristine white of her hanbok. The man's face was a mask of cold granite, his eyes sweeping over the room with an unnerving stillness that was more terrifying than any shout. Every nurse froze. Doctors looked down at their charts, suddenly fascinated by routine paperwork. The usual ER symphony of beeps and cries and hurried footsteps died into a single, held breath. Chloe watched, her exhaustion a heavy blanket, as the man laid the woman on the nearest empty gurney. He was Kwon Ji-hoon, and even in a city that pretended not to have a dark underbelly, everyone knew his name. He was the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate, a Korean mafia boss whose influence was woven into the very fabric of the metropolis. And his mother was bleeding. Kwon Ji-hoon felt the silence as a physical pressure. It was the silence of fear, a tool he had sharpened and wielded his entire life. But now it was a weapon turned against him. His mother's breathing was shallow, a faint, rattling sound that tore at the edges of his control. He had built an empire of silence and respect, and in the one moment it mattered, it had rendered every so-called professional in this room useless. He could have a man's life extinguished with a single nod, but he couldn't make a doctor look him in the eye. His gaze, black and cold as river stones, scanned the faces of the cowards. He saw them flinch, their gazes skittering away like startled insects. Useless. All of them. His rage was a white-hot coal in his chest, threatening to burn through the iron discipline that had kept him alive, kept him in power. He needed to scream, to tear this place apart until anyone moved. But he held it in, the pressure building behind his teeth. And then he saw her, a young woman, a nurse, her face etched with a weariness so profound it seemed to eclipse fear. She was leaning against a counter, her posture slumped, but her eyes were fixed on his mother. Not on him, not on his men who flanked him like stone gargoyles. On the small, frail woman on the gurney. He watched as she pushed herself upright, a small, deliberate movement in a room of statues. She started walking towards them, towards him. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the squeak of her worn sneakers against the linoleum, the only sound in his universe. Chloe's feet felt like lead, each step a conscious effort of will. She didn't know what propelled her forward. It wasn't bravery. It was something closer to professional indignation. An old woman was dying while a room full of medical staff played dead. The man, the Korean mafia boss, watched her approach, his stillness absolute. She could feel the weight of his stare, the collective gasp of her colleagues behind her. She ignored it all, her focus narrowing to the patient. She stopped at the side of the gurney, her gaze clinical as she took in the shallow respirations, the pallid skin, the blood. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves from her pocket with a practiced snap. She did not look at the sun. She did not acknowledge the silent threat of the men surrounding them. What happened? Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The tone she used when a situation was critical and panic was a luxury. The silence stretched. She finally lifted her eyes to meet Kwon Ji-hoon's. They were dark, bottomless, but she saw something flicker in their depths. not anger.
Surprise.
She needs a trauma bay.
Now.
And someone get me a CBC, type and cross, and page Dr. Albright. The orders came out crisp and clear, cutting through the fear-choked atmosphere. A few of the younger nurses, startled into action by a voice that sounded like their own, finally moved. Ji-hoon didn't speak. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, as she began to cut away the blood-soaked silk of his mother's gown, her movements efficient and sure. For the first time all night, the air in the emergency room began to move again. As she worked, stabilizing a line and checking vitals, a detail snagged her attention. One of the guards, the one standing closest to Ji-hoon's right shoulder, had a tattoo peeking from beneath his cuff. It was a dragon, its scales rendered in exquisite black ink, but it was coiled around a single, delicate hibiscus flower. Chloe's breath hitched. She'd seen it once before, years ago, on the wrist of a terrified young man who'd come in with a stab wound and refused to speak to the police. He'd been one of them. Before they'd taken him to surgery, he'd whispered a phrase to her, a nonsense rhyme she'd never forgotten. A password. A plea. Without thinking, her training and exhaustion overriding common sense, she murmured it, her voice low enough that only the guard and Ji-hoon could hear. The hibiscus withers in the shade. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fragment of a forgotten code. The guard's stony expression didn't change, but his shoulders lost an infinitesimal amount of tension. His eyes flickered to Ji-hoon, a barely perceptible signal. And Ji-hoon, who had been watching her hands, her face, her every move, went absolutely still. His focus shifted from a general, dangerous watchfulness to something sharp, analytical, and intensely personal. He was no longer just looking at a nurse. He was looking at a puzzle. He had built his world on secrets and codes, on walls of silence. And this tired girl in pale blue scrubs had just walked through one of them as if it were an open door. She didn't know what she had done, but he did. She had just become the most dangerous, most fascinating person in the room. His mother was alive, stabilized, transferred to a private suite on a floor that had been cleared for his exclusive use. The hospital administration had bent over backwards, their earlier fear transmuting into fawning obsequiousness once the immediate danger to their staff had passed. Ji-hoon stood in the silent, antiseptic-smelling hallway outside the room, the adrenaline of the past hour leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He watched the nurse, Chloe, through the glass. She was speaking to another doctor, her posture still radiating a quiet competence that seemed utterly at odds with the chaos she had stepped into. When she finished and turned to leave, he moved, blocking her path. He was a shadow in the dim corridor. She stopped, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. It was a normal reaction, the correct one, but it was still a disappointment. "You are finished for the night," he said. It was not a question. "My shift ended 2 hours ago," she replied, her voice still professionally flat, but he could hear the exhaustion fraying the edges. "I will pay you, triple your salary. You will become my mother's private nurse. You will not work for this hospital anymore. You will work for me." The offer hung in the air between them, audacious and absolute. He was not asking. He was informing her of a change in her circumstances. Chloe stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. This was insane. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in the middle of a Tuesday night shift from hell. She should say no. She should run. But she thought of her student loans, the stack of bills on her counter, the sheer, bone-deep weariness of her life. And she looked at the powerful Korean Mafia boss, whose entire empire couldn't save his mother, and saw the raw desperation behind the command. The penthouse was less an apartment and more a sterile kingdom in the clouds. Glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city lights, a glittering, indifferent tapestry far below. There was no clutter, no warmth, just shades of gray and black and the gleam of polished chrome. It was a beautiful prison. Chloe's world had shrunk to this room, to the quiet, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor and the soft rustle of sheets as she tended to her patient. Mrs. Kwan remained unconscious, a silent, fragile queen in her high-tech hospital bed. And her son, Kwon Ji-hoon, was a constant, unnerving presence. He didn't hover, but he was always there. Sometimes he would be in an armchair in the corner, reading documents on a tablet, the blue light casting sharp angles on his face. Other times, he would simply stand by the window, looking out at the city he owned, his back a rigid line of tension. He rarely spoke to Chloe directly, giving his orders for food, for supplies, through one of his guards. But she felt his eyes on her constantly. It was a heavy, assessing gaze that missed nothing. The way she soothed his mother's brow with a cool cloth, the gentle, one-sided conversations she had with the comatose woman, the slight tremor in her hands when she checked in 4-line after 36 hours without real sleep. One evening, as she was charting the day's vitals, he finally broke the silence that had defined their strange arrangement. "Why did you help?" His voice was low, cutting through the quiet hum of the machines. Chloe didn't look up from her chart. "It's my job. Others have the same job." They did not move. She finally met his gaze. "They were afraid. And you are not?" Chloe thought for a long moment, the pen still in her hand. "I was too tired to be afraid. A ghost of something. Not quite a smile, but a loosening of the hard lines around his mouth, appeared for a second before vanishing." Days bled into a week, then 2. The rhythm of the penthouse became Chloe's life. Wake, care for Mrs. Kwan, chart, sleep, repeat. The city outside the glass walls felt like another planet. The only human contact she had was with the silent, watchful guards and the man who owned her time. The quiet between them began to change. It was no longer the tense silence of a captor and his prisoner, but something more complex, something weighted with unspoken curiosity. One night, a storm rolled in, the same violent rain from the night they met lashing against the windows. Chloe was reading aloud to Mrs. Kwan from a book of Korean poetry she'd found on a shelf, her voice a soft murmur against the drumming of the rain. She didn't hear Ji-hoon enter. She only knew he was there when she felt his presence beside her. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood there, listening. "She loved that poem," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "My father used to read it to her." It was the first time he had mentioned his father, the first crack she had ever seen in the facade of the untouchable Korean Mafia boss. She looked up at him. The shadows in the room softened his face, and for a moment, he wasn't a crime lord. He was just a son, watching his mother sleep, lost in a memory. "She can hear you, you know," Chloe said softly. "Even if she can't answer. You should talk to her." He looked from his mother's peaceful face to Chloe's. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the gravity of his violent world and the simple, profound intimacy of the sick room. He pulled a chair closer, sat down, and in a low, halting voice, he began to speak to his mother in Korean, his words a gentle current in the stormy night. The crisis, when it came, was not a storm but a whisper. A single, discordant chime from the penthouse security system, a sound so subtle Chloe almost missed it. But Ji-hoon heard it. He was on his feet in an instant, his body transforming from quiet contemplation to lethal readiness. The stillness was gone, replaced by a fluid, dangerous grace. 2 of his guards materialized in the doorway, their faces grim, guns already in their hands. "Living room," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low command. Intruders on this floor, his first move was not towards the door, not towards the fight. It was towards her. He crossed the room in 2 strides and put himself between Chloe and the door, his body a solid wall. He pushed her gently but firmly towards the corner behind his mother's bed. Stay here. Do not move. The order was absolute, the voice of the Mafia boss she had first met. But the eyes that met hers held a different emotion entirely. It was a raw, desperate fear. Not for himself. For her. For his mother. Sounds of a struggle erupted from the other room. Sharp, brutal, and blessedly brief. Through it all, Ji-hoon did not move from his position. He stood guard over the two women in the room, his focus absolute, his body a shield. In that moment, Chloe understood. His power, his empire, his reputation, it was all armor. And the only thing he truly cared to protect was in this room. The violence was an extension of his fear, and his control was a cage he had built to contain his own vulnerability. The cold, powerful man was a myth. The terrified son was real. The silence that descended after the fight was heavier than the one before. It was a silence filled with the smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood. One of the guards appeared in the doorway, gave a slight nod, and disappeared. The threat was over. Ji-hoon's shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, slumped. He turned slowly, his eyes finding Chloe's in the dim light. The mask was gone. His face was pale, his control shattered, leaving behind a stark, aching vulnerability. He walked towards her, his steps unsteady. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. They know I have a weakness now, he whispered, the words ragged. Before, it was just her, his gaze flickered to his mother. Now, there is you, it was a confession. A declaration. He was the most powerful criminal in the city, a man who commanded legions, and he was laid bare by a 20-year-old nurse who was too tired to be scared of him. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. You see me, he said, his voice barely audible. No one else does. They see the monster, the boss. You see a son. You speak to me as if I am a man. The truth of it settled over her, heavy and undeniable. You will not leave this house, he said. It wasn't a threat, not anymore. It was a plea, a statement of fact, the desperate logic of a man who had finally found something more valuable than power. You will stay. With me. You will be my wife. Chloe stared at Kwon Ji-hoon, his words hanging in the air like smoke. Wife. The word was absurd, impossible. It belonged to another world, one with courtship and choices and futures that didn't involve assassins in the living room. She looked past him, at the still, sleeping form of his mother, the woman who had inadvertently brought them together. She thought of the hospital, the endless shifts, the thankless work, the crushing weight of being invisible, just another set of hands in light blue scrubs. Here, in this gilded cage, she was not invisible. She was seen so clearly it terrified her. She was a weakness. She was a strength. She was the calm center of this violent man's world. Was this love? She didn't know. It was too tangled with fear and obligation and a strange, fierce sense of belonging. But she knew that walking away, back to her old life, would feel like a different kind of death. It would be a return to the gray, to the exhaustion, to being no one of consequence. Here, she held the life of a matriarch in her hands. Here, she held the heart of a king. He was a monster to the world, a ruthless Korean mafia boss who dealt in death and fear. But in this room, he was just Ji-hoon, and he was hers to save or to break. She took a slow breath, the antiseptic smell of the room filling her lungs. She looked into his dark, waiting eyes, eyes that held entire empires of pain and power, and saw her own reflection. She had stepped forward in that emergency room out of a sense of duty. Now, she would step forward again, out of something far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more real. Yes, she said. The single word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a promise, sealing their future in the silent, watchful city.